Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be back with all of you here today at the Bear Psychology Radio Show, bearing witness to mood, mind, and human resilience. I'm your host, and today's show takes us into a very challenging but necessary conversation about truth and healing. And the transformation doesn't begin in light, it begins in darkness. We're exploring the shadow of a figure of light, the archetype of the alcoholic on the journey to enlightenment by Cody Peterson. I've got the book in front of me that is well dog-eared, and I'm so glad to have Cody Peterson with us. I'm going to say it's a very interesting book, and I'm glad that we finally got Cody on. We tried to get him on earlier last year, I think, in the summer maybe, and that didn't work, and we have persevered. On the jacket cover, Cody describes himself as a desert rat, which I'm sure he's going to explain to us, of the American Southwest, shaped by years of housing insecurity, homelessness, and jail. And then Cody chooses the pen instead of the bottle to travel within. I will want to know more about that journey, as most of you will be interested in as well. And in the foreword, Stephen Herman writes, "A light can emerge from darkness." And that's linked to the history of the emergence of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm very interested in that story because I know that that has made a huge difference in the lives of many people. AA co-founder Story of Sobriety, that starts in 1934 in New York. And one more quote before we get to Cody. This is from Jung, Carl Jung. "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The latter procedure, however, is disagreeable and therefore not popular." Cody, thank you for joining us. How did you ever find your way to us?
Well, I mean, mostly by accident, probably. Certainly have been guided probably by ghosts, I guess. The ghosts of the desert. There was so many things that you said in your intro. I'm trying to recall all of them, but I'm truly honored to be here. I think one of the most profound experiences was to actually write this book, because in large part it was my attempt at having a conversation, like a conversation that perhaps the people closest to me, I mean, my wife can have the conversation with me, but basically in my inner circle, nobody else, right? So this was sort of a message in a bottle. And so here I am, very honored to be able to have this conversation with you. That feels like the culmination of a dream, and really the purpose of the book coming true. So it's great. And what a wonderful quote from Jung, right? Making the darkness conscious. It's not popular because it's not easy.
It isn't easy. Yeah, to be able to sit with that, with your own inner landscape with some grace is a pretty tall order that, in your book, you frame alcoholism not as a disorder, but as a spiritual and psychological crisis. Can you tell me a little bit about that deeper struggle with meaning, identity, and transformation?
Sure. I mean, for me, I guess alcoholism has really kind of shaped my life from when I was very young. I grew up in an alcoholic environment. And there was something that there was something that I began to recognize about myself when I was around 17 years old, and kind of still struggling, well, definitely still struggling with addiction. And it's that I'm I was always drawn to the idea of a higher power. And I think early on that conception was more of like a traditional kind of Western conception, right? The corporeal being residing in heaven or whatever. But I was always drawn to this. And over the years and really the decades of struggling with addiction and with alcoholism, it became very apparent to me that in terms of as a disease, if we can call it that, just for sake of kind of ease, I guess, it's very misunderstood. And that, just for myself, that part of my draw toward both alcohol and drugs was really just to try to find a sense of ease and comfort. That's language that you'll find in Alcoholics Anonymous, right? The alcoholic is really seeking a sense of ease and comfort. And Jung comes around and in his way really kind of lets us know that really what's kind of underneath that longing for ease and comfort is what he called a spiritual thirst for wholeness. And and in my experience, this really is what's driving the alcoholic, right, or the drug addict, or really anyone. And I think it underlies all of our compulsions. And this is a big point that I make in the book. Jung talked about compulsion being the fundamental mystery of humankind. Are these compulsive drives that we have? There's something that drives us. Sometimes it manifests as alcoholism. Sometimes it manifests as an inability to control our temper, road rage, whatever it is. I like what James Hollis says. All of us wake up in the morning and say, well, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to repeat the same behavior that I did yesterday today. And then what do? We repeat the behavior. So there's this underlying compulsive nature that we experience as humans. And I feel like alcoholism and the alcoholic is really the embodiment of that drive for wholeness, and that as Jung would say, the part of the self that's moving us into really transformation and integration.
Yeah, I think what you had started with, this idea of spiritual thirst for wholeness and just the raw pain that lands a person into the spiral of addiction it's pretty gripping.
Mm.
Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with Jelly Roll's Save Me. I love,
Unfortunately, I'm not.
okay, I love this song by this artist. And in the song he writes, it's 2021 release, so it's not ancient, right?
Yeah.
He writes, somebody save me from myself. I've spent so long living in hell. They say my lifestyle is bad for my health. It's the only thing that seems to help. All this drinking and smoking is hopeless, but feel like it's all that I need. Something inside of me is broken. I hold on to anything that sets me free. And when you listen to him sing, you can feel how um, deep the struggle is
Mm.
and the desire for that sense of freedom from the pain that he is experiencing. I wonder if you can just share a little bit about the kind of the what is referred to in your book is a hero's plunge into darkness, a pilgrimage, spiritual transformation is only found in darkness. That's a quote from your book.
Mm. Yeah, it's true, and I really appreciate Jelly Roll's sentiment there. That there's a kind of I'm reminded of something Joseph Campbell talked about quite often, actually, in a lot of his talks. He talks about Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Mhm.
and then he basically kind of deconstructs Maslow's hierarchy, saying that the most boring people are the ones who are at the pinnacle, and that there's something that it lacks that kind of religious devotion, right? Like if we were to structure our lives on Maslow's hierarchy, like we're missing the point. And what I find interesting about like even what Jelly Roll sings about is that underlying addiction and alcoholism, there, if indeed uh it is indicative of the thirst for wholeness, then what we see in drug addicts and alcoholics is religious devotion of the most profound category. So much so that very often, I live in Las Vegas, and the streets are full of drug addicts and alcoholics who are homeless and lost, and they're panhandling, and all they need is like $1 so that they can get another bottle, which probably at this point doesn't even make them feel better. It just it stops them from feeling bad, which is the most devastating kind of addiction, where you're using just to not have to like be basically detoxing. um but underlying that behavior is this devotion to dealing with that pain, right? And that the pain is so apparent that the alcoholic is willing to really go to any length to kind of cope with it, or to make it to to make it go away. But Jelly Roll understands too, though, that the pain doesn't actually go away, right? um but maybe it can be dealt with differently, right? there's I'm always surprised, being in recovery, how similar life can feel. So if I'm devoted to the 12 steps, and to living this spiritual life, and to trying to give myself, and I'm going to meetings, and maybe I'm even doing a little too much recovery, right? But there's that same kind of draw towards the spirituality. And so like living life in recovery can often feel quite similar to living life as an alcoholic, because underlying it is the same religious drive, the same pull toward transformation. um and it's, I think in a really big way, it's indicative of all of our desires to escape pain, and our inability to really sit with pain, to do the work, inside of the pain, that I'm sure you do as a psychologist and try to encourage people to do. Um, but the culture is, we are so addicted to feeling good, um, and so reluctant to own our own compulsions, that it's the alcoholic becomes an embodiment of the culture, of Western culture's need, uh, and lack of spirituality.
Wow. Okay. And when you talk about spirituality, I am getting this feeling that this has nothing to do with any particular, I mean, it might, but it doesn't seem to have anything particularly to do with one root of religiosity or another, but rather something that goes beyond that. The other thing that you said that really lands with me is escaping pain as opposed to leaning in toward yourself to discover yourself within acceptance of that pain. And that, from my perspective, from a really deep psychological kind of like a depth psychology, is like what happens with us as individuals when we allow ourselves not to reject the pain, but to actually allow space for it um, with kindness and curiosity.
Mm. I so and I love the so I because I've heard kind of two sentences, right? The one is or two statements. So the first is like, what is spirituality? And then the second is, how do we cope with pain?
Mhm.
And this has been something that I really learned after I published the book. Um and and I think for me, if I was to really define spirituality, I would have to define it as every attempt we make at escaping pain. Um, I think that, and so, and I think that, I think in a way, there's this. I think even the tendency, like in therapy and stuff, is that if I can like work hard enough, I won't have to feel this way anymore, right? And if like if I do a EMDR, for example, then I'll be able to cope with these feelings that I don't really like having, and then hopefully like I'll be able to stop doing this therapy, and I won't have to feel these feelings, right? Um, and I think that so to go back to the spirituality thing, that the word itself, spirituality, means volatile substance, and the original, it I think etymologically, spiritus, spirits, was the distilled essence, right? And so and alcohol is the distilled essence of wine. And it's very interesting to me that etymologically, alcoholism and spirituality share a root, um, because I think we learn a lot about what spirituality is from watching The Alcoholic. Um, because on one hand, the alcoholic is always attempting to escape, right? To sort of volatilize uh, his or her problems, um, and yet in the action of that, trying to not have to feel the pain. Um, Underneath, the soul is kind of like is always pulling down in this sort of we call it depression, right? It's this constant pull downward. And and yet, and as Jung would say, the self is kind of orchestrating the whole thing, and 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 that eventually the self catches up. I love what Jung says, and I quote this in the book, that there's a diabolical element within every human that is essentially driving us, as the wind drives a sail, right? And it's launching us towards shipwreck, and there's really nothing we can do about it. um and yet the ego tries to maintain control, right? This delusion of control, which is what I talk about so much in the book. And this sort of dream that we have, or this illusion that in fact we're not driven, that in fact we don't experience compulsion, that if we were just more spiritual, or if we just did more therapy, or if we just went to church more, we wouldn't have these drives deep down within us. And but the point is that no matter how much work we do, the essence of being a human being is this being driven by this mystery of compulsion. Um, and this to me is perhaps the biggest breakthrough that I was able to make for myself in writing the book, is that there really is no escape from this human condition, right? And no, and that, my problem isn't that I'm not spiritual enough. Uh, and I think God, whatever that means, that I don't really have to tell myself that anymore, right? Like, um, I'm that there is no easy way out. I'm more and more comfortable with this concept, and that these compulsions are perhaps um more indicative of who I am and my true self than anything else that I try to do to cover them up.
I'm so riveted by what you're saying, and I love that you just said there is no escape from the human condition, and there are drivers inside of us that I think most of us would like to suppress because they are transformational impulses that forever, push us towards this growth pattern that isn't always so easy to allow ourselves to move towards. So thank you for raising that, and also bringing awareness to the idea that it's not so much about just no longer feeling pain, but recognizing it's just part of the condition. It's okay, it's okay. And I think it's so beautiful that you're saying that to our listeners today. And by the way, I will just mention, thank you very much. The emails are coming in, and people who've been with us for a while know that we love to receive the emails and have a conversation. So if you're interested in sharing something with us or asking a question, or just communicating something, in studio101@gmail.com. And I'm actually going to start reading some of these emails and see how we do. So I haven't actually opened up any of them. Here are some just very simple questions, Cody, that actually refer directly to you because people are curious, you know? One is asking, what was Cody in jail for? Just
Um,
human curiosity.
I love that. That's
Gotta
great.
know.
We've got to put a story with the face. So,
Yes,
um,
exactly. So please do that.
yeah, mostly, mostly like, so I'm like what I would consider like a petty criminal. So I did get two second degree felony charges, in the state of Utah in 2005. Um, I'll tell. I don't know. I'm feeling impressed to tell the story. So I lived in a van, a little Astro van that my parents had bought me, so I didn't have to sleep on the street. And I was with some other, uh, certain kinds of people that were quite like me, and we had driven away from the drug dealer's house, and the drug task force pulled us over, and I lived in the van, and so we all got out of the van. They searched the van because, of course, I didn't have registration and insurance and no driver's license because I was, too unmanageable to pay my parking tickets and speeding tickets and whatever else. And they ended up finding some empty baggies and some broken drug paraphernalia, and so they arrested me for two second degree felonies. And so there's a for all of the Billy Strings fans, there's a song that he wrote called Dust in a Baggie. I'm sure Jelly Roll's a fan. And I did 20 long years in prison for some dust in a baggie, and that's kind of my story. So I wasn't a big time criminal. I was just unable to maintain. So I ended up spending about 6 months in jail at that time. I think I was in and out of jail probably maybe 15 times over the course of my alcoholic career, as we like to call it. Um, so yeah, that's what I was in jail for. I hope that's not TMI.
Not from my point of view. I mean, it seems like a story that people live through. And, if you're lucky enough to just have that part of your story, because it seems actually, in a way, it's tamer than it could be, isn't it?
It is, um, and I think that that's a really interesting way of putting it. And this, it kind of goes back to what I had said earlier in the beginning of the interview, that it's drug addicts and alcoholics are, and it just, I mean, it goes back to Jelly Roll too. Like, I love that we're just able to talk about Jelly Roll so much, but that it's not like what it looks like on the outside might be like this sort of criminal, like dangerous behavior, but really inside it's just a longing to feel okay. And very often I think, it's like in the 12-step fellowships, like my story is just run of the mill. Like, I would never consider writing a book about my story, because I've heard so many just insane stories of people that go through like real difficult times and end up getting sober, and it's beautiful. Um but really underlying like all of it is this. And I love that, like, as alcoholics and drug addicts, we can find these fellowships, and we can find understanding and recognition that, like, our parents might have thought we were criminals, and the society might think that we're no good. The police don't treat us well, on and on. But that we understand, like, as like a culture, like within the culture, that really we're just trying to survive, and that as luck would have it, we became powerless over alcohol or drugs. And yet we're also able to learn, I think, as we do more work and we kind of go deeper, it's that we're not really just powerless over drugs and alcohol, right? We're really powerless over so many other things. Um, and so they just, that understanding gives us room to grow, and room to develop. So and that's why you'll hear, one of the most paradoxical statements, if you spend any time in a 12-step room, you'll hear people say, my name is so and so, and I'm a grateful alcoholic, or I'm Joe, and I'm a grateful drug addict. And it just doesn't make any sense. Why would you be grateful for that? But that's the point of that. It's so profoundly Jungian, right? That through this horrible experience and this very profound compulsion, emerges this kind of new life and this new way of living, and this new connection to the universe and to people. So yeah, so that's how I feel about that. Yeah, thanks for the questions. I like these kinds of questions. It's
Yeah, I
fun
do.
to it's fun to talk about this stuff in a crowd of normies, you know. So
Well, don't make any assumptions,
oh,
Cody. I don't
I
know.
will. But yeah, oh, I'm sure with
I,
18,000, there's at least 180 alcoholics in the crowd.
I just don't know. Okay, let's pivot back to
Okay,
the 12 steps and what they represent in the journey, and how it weaves into Jung and mystical experiences and all that stuff. Because it's like in your book, I'm gonna show it again. And by the way, people are making comments about the front cover, and I don't know who came up with that, but whoo, we got to talk about this guy, eh?
okay, yeah,
Yeah. So let's understand the 12 steps, some of that history, which you know probably better than most people do, and how that weaves into that mystical journey.
sure. Sure. And looking back so far, this is my favorite part of the book, is the first four chapters. Um, and the story really begins. I mean, it's very interesting. Like, so it's been pretty well known that Carl Jung played somewhat of a role in the establishment of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that and the kind of the myth, right? The creation myth of the 12 steps is typically only goes back as far as a gentleman named Roland Hazard, who was, by today's standards, a billionaire who lived on the East Coast, and he couldn't stop drinking. So, and he's from a very wealthy family, and he's got all the money in the world. So, the legend would have it that he was unable to get in with Sigmund Freud, and so he took what he considered the next best thing, and was able to to go and be treated by Carl Jung in Switzerland. And for a long time, it was always assumed that this meeting took place in 1931, maybe 1932. But in the early 2000s, some investigators, some researchers discovered some journals from Leonard Bacon, who was a poet. I think he was a Pulitzer poet, who was Roland Hazard's cousin. And Leonard was the one who introduced Roland to Carl Jung, and set up the meeting, and took a real interest in trying to help I think it was his uncle, get sober, Roland. So anyways, Roland ends up, but what the researchers discovered was that Roland Hazard actually met Carl Jung in 1926. And it was in April, May of 1926, and it's in the records, right? They have receipts, like I think it paid a huge amount of money. I did the math once. I think it was like $50,000 or something, by today's standards, maybe even more now, to be with Jung for about a month, and they did analysis and stuff like that. So, and that was interesting information as well. While I was writing the book, I began working with Stephen Herman, and I was kind of using Stephen as like kind of like an extra set of eyes. He's a Jungian analyst, so, and I basically, like, I employed him to like help me like look at the book from a Jungian perspective. I wanted to make sure that the things I was writing about were accurate, and while we were working together, he brought forth an essay that he had written in like 2013 or maybe 2014 that he never published, about a gentleman named Jaime de Angelo. So, and Stephen is from the Bay Area, and Jaime he was a Spaniard, but ended up also in the Bay Area of California. And if you do, I mean, Jaime is a really interesting character. So aside from the story I tell about him, he was a famous poet. He was like the grandfather of the beatnik movement on the West Coast. Ezra Pound is a famous poet, referred to Jaime as the Ovid of the West, or the Ovid of America, or something like that. So and he was a great poet. He was friends with all of these famous poets, like just really, really profound character, this guy, but he was also an alcoholic. And Jaime, he came out to the States, or he came out West in 1921, or maybe a couple years earlier, and he invented this form of anthropology called going native. And his method for going native was that he moved out into the mountains on the East Coast, the eastern slopes of Mount Shasta, up in Northern California. This big, beautiful, still very kind of remote feeling area, rivers and trees, and he had a little ranch out there. And one day he met some natives, some indigenous folk from the Achumawe tribe. And Jaime he kind of hit it off very well with the natives, because he liked to drink and they liked to drink. And there's also some evidence here which I was able to pull up. And I was really surprised nobody had said this, because a lot of people have done a lot of work on Jaime, but that the back then there's some evidence that the Achumawe were using psychedelic mushrooms as part of their religious ceremonies. And of course, a guy like Jaime would have been intrigued by this. And it does appear that he even references some of that in his writings, and I show that in my book. To make a long story short, I guess, it's a riveting story, and there's so many details. Jaime ended up getting divorced from his wife, who was named Carrie. I can't remember her original name, but she ends up becoming Carrie Baines, who ends up becoming a Jungian analyst. But when Jaime and Carrie divorced in 1923, Carrie moved to Switzerland, and was treated by Jung. And they had a child together, and Carrie was fighting for custody. She was concerned about Jaime's alcoholism, and she started working with Tony Wolff. But then I think as Jung heard about Jaime's kind of romps in the woods, he became really intrigued. So he started working with Carrie one-on-one, and they would even and Jaime and Carrie would continue corresponding through this time. And then Carrie would bring the letters to Jung, and they would read them. And then Jung would respond like through Carrie's letters. So there is some of this, some of these letters survive. And they're very interesting, because what we see here early on is Jung beginning to formulate the idea of spiritus contra spiritum, which is the phrase that he uses with Bill Wilson in the letter from 1961, where he's saying that where he talks about alcoholism as a longing for wholeness. So Jaime ends up going out to Switzerland to meet Jung himself in 1923, and they have a great time. They actually hop in a canoe and go across the lake at Jung's place in Bollingen, and they camp for a week. I think Jung loved the outdoors, and Jaime, of course, would have been a great guy to camp with, because he probably was building fire with sticks and catching fish with his bare hands, because he spent so much time in the woods with his indigenous friends. And there's not a lot of evidence as to how deep they got in their conversations about Jaime's own kind of issues, whether Jung kind of got him on the couch or not. But Jaime does, later on, he referred to the meeting with Jung as something very profound and helpful for him. So then in 1924 or 1925, I think it was January of 1925. I need to brush up on my history. In January of 1925, Jung, on a whim, came to the States. Jung loved getting on the boats because he loved all the space. This is what Stephen Herman writes about in Doorways to the Self. So Jung just, on a whim, comes to the States, and Jaime catches word that Jung is in the States, and he basically says, "Hey, let's go to Taos. Let's go to Taos, New Mexico." So the Taos tribe had. So this was still during the crisis in American history, where called Kill the Indian, Save the Man. So they were rounding up indigenous youth and putting them in camps and trying to stamp out native religion, native culture. The white government was really trying to do whatever it could to make that culture kind of go away. And in response to this, the Taos had the ingenious idea of bringing influential Western writers to Taos to kind of show them the culture, to let them participate in religious ceremonies, etc. D.H. Lawrence was among the first to go to Taos. D.H. Lawrence is a famous poet. D.H. Lawrence is also friends with Jaime DeAngelo. And there's a fun side story so Jaime was bisexual. I think D.H. Lawrence was either bisexual or homosexual. And at a certain point, D.H. Lawrence actually made a pass at Jaime, which Jaime refused because he said D.H. Lawrence smelled bad. So, and which I think is just fascinating. But anyways, it would appear that D.H. Lawrence was kind of allowed was able, kind of set them up, and Jaime was friends with someone else from the tribe as well, and Jaime was able to convince the tribe to let Jung come to Taos. And so, and it's just such a wonderful story. So Jung, he gets on a train, and he takes a train to the south rim of the Grand Canyon in 1925, January. They stayed at the El Tovar Lodge, which is still there. It's probably still looks a lot like it did back then. And he spends a couple days on the south rim, and then he telegrams Jaime and says, "Pick me up. I'm ready to go, and I'll pay for the trip." And Jung was pretty wealthy, and Jaime was broke because he was an alcoholic. And so Jaime rents a car, a Chevrolet, and picks Jung up on the South Rim, and they take a road trip. They drive, and if you've taken that road trip, it's quite beautiful, down into Flagstaff, down the mountains, incidentally called the San Francisco Mountain Range, and they go through Albuquerque, down to Taos, or down to Albuquerque, and then up into Taos, and anyways, they're there. So, and I know this is a long story, but it's so worth telling.
It's so interesting. You have me sitting on the edge of my seat.
Yes. So it's once they get to Taos, this really, and I didn't put this story in my book, and maybe I'll do another edition, but that while they're in Taos, Jaime, he's probably, there's evidence that Jaime's alcoholism by this point had kind of started to get the better of him. And there's sort of an urban legend that one morning they're at breakfast in Taos, and they're staying at a famous place. It's still there. It's Mabel Dodge's place. I think you can still rent rooms there, and that's where Jung is staying. And Jung's got a couple of his European friends with him, and Jaime's there, and Jaime's basically at this point basically identifying as a Native American almost. And Jaime and the story goes that they're having breakfast, and Jaime becomes angry, and he's already drunk, most likely, early in the morning. And he becomes angry because he realizes that Jung and his buddies are just a bunch of Europeans, and they don't really understand the culture. They're trying to talk about these archetypes or this or that, and that they're missing the point of what the native religion means in terms of nature and their own connection to that specific piece of land. And Jaime's he's upset because there's no way like a bunch of white people can understand this. And so he pulls out a straight razor, and he leans over the table, and he slits his throat ear to ear. It just bleeds all over the place. And obviously things don't go well. And they end up wrapping up their trip, and Jung. So, and this is where the story is interesting and really diverges into the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. So while they were there, Jung was able to talk to one of the elders named Mountain Lake. And there's questions about whether he was an elder or not, but and Jung kind of has this big sort of spiritual moment where he realizes that that the connection that he has it's not quite it, right? Like he does notice in Mountain Lake this kind of ability to, they refer to Father Sky, and Jung recognizes like he doesn't have his own myth, right? His own myth of meaning. And it's a big moment. Jung talks about this in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. Anyways, they separate, they go their separate ways. Jung ends up going to Africa shortly thereafter. And it's later in the year, he goes to Africa for 4 or 5 months. He goes with Carrie Baines, Jaime's ex, who's now married to Helton Baines, who was the wealthy individual who paid for their trip to Africa. And if you've read Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, then you'll recall Jung's moment where he's stepped away from the tour group, and he's looking at the plains, and he really has this big moment where he realizes what it means to be living and to be witnessing you know, to be conscious, right? The evolution of consciousness, and to be aware of like the gazelle and the zebra, and to feel connected, right? And Jung, in this moment, basically, Jung kind of says, I found my myth. And I found my myth, and I'm reminded of that moment in Taos. And so Jung has this big coming to, and the way this time, so that he returns back to Switzerland, I think in March and of 1926, and then in April of 1926, barely 5 or 6 weeks after this big trip to Africa and this trip to Taos and his friendship with Jaime and Jaime's alcoholism, the whole thing, that's when Roland Hazard shows up, right? So Roland Hazard, this alcoholic billionaire who can't stay sober, sits down with Jung. And the famous story in Alcoholics Anonymous is that Jung tells Roland, I have worked with alcoholics before, and I've recognized that there's nothing I can do to help them. They must have a spiritual experience. And the connection that I make in my book is that it seems fairly clear that Jung would have only learned that kind of depth of understanding of the nature of the disease of alcoholism from his own interactions with Jaime de Angelo, who was a raging alcoholic by every imaginable standard. And so that it's a profound kind of, it's an addition to the creation myth of the 12 steps, right? Because Roland ends up, he gets sober for a while. He kind of goes in and out of sobriety. He ends up taking his own trip to Africa the next year. He buys some property in New Mexico. All very interesting connections. We don't know if Jung directly affected him in making those decisions, but it looks like probably, you know, because Roland was seeking this thing that Jung had found. Roland ends up in the hospital in 1932 in New York City, and he's dying from alcohol yet again. And he ends up joining an organization called the Oxford Group. And in the Oxford Group, the idea is that you help other people kind of join. And he was an alcoholic, and so he was trying to help other alcoholics kind of get sober and join the Oxford Group. And he became a speaker, and Jung actually refers to Roland Hazard in volume 18 in one of his famous talks. And one of the people that Roland helps get sober is a gentleman named Ebby Thatcher. And Ebby was from a wealthy family in Vermont. And he's getting ready to go to jail because he parked his car in somebody's kitchen. And it was like the fourth or fifth time this had happened within a couple years. And the judge had it. And Roland basically showed up to court and told the judge, hey, why don't you let me take Ebby? And Roland then instructed Ebby to move to New York City in Calvary, the Calvary mission. And Ebby, he remembered one day, oh, I've got my buddy Bill Wilson, maybe I can help him. And so Ebby shows up to Bill's door on a November of 1934. And really, if you know anything about AA and the 12 steps, like the rest is history. So Ebby helps Bill Wilson get sober, and then Bill Wilson, stays sober for a while. He helps Dr. Bob get sober, and then that's how Alcoholics Anonymous is formed. And it's very interesting because the key message of AA and all of the 12 steps is that really that Jungian message, right? That alcoholism or addiction is a manifestation of our longing for wholeness, and that we go back to the mystery of compulsion, right? It begins with step one. We admitted we were powerless. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, over drugs, maybe over chocolate cake, whatever it is, right? We're powerless. We are compelled. And then this step two is really what Jung is credited with, is that we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And I would suggest that Jung, more than anywhere else in his life before 1926, probably learned that spiritual message for the alcoholic from his interactions with Jaime de Angelo. So
Wow. Okay. Okay. You have had me honestly sitting at the edge of my seat. That is a profound story. I know, Cody, that a lot of this is in the book.
mhm, it is.
Because as I said to you, and you were like shocked, like I actually read the book, and it seems like maybe some people that interview you don't actually read the book. But listen, this is a great book. It's worth reading. I have had so many emails, and I'm so
Mm.
sorry because usually I get through a few more emails, but I could not stop you. That was too rich. Oh my goodness. Listen, two things that I am struck with. Wilson is credited with saying a vital spiritual experience is needed in order to find meaningful and lasting sobriety. That door doesn't open for everybody. On some level, although it can happen automatically, like without effort for some people, like it's like you flip a switch and then you're right in the middle of it. For some people, it does not become easily or readily available. There is some grappling that has to happen for somebody to get there. And then the other piece is Jung, his own transformation into meaning in life, and his statement, however it was put, a power greater than ourselves is needed to restore us to sanity. Both leave us with the realization of something greater than ourselves, a concept that, is very kind of interwoven in AA and the 12 steps and all of this. We've got about 8 minutes left. I have so many questions. I can't wait for you to come back to us, Cody. Maybe you'll do part two because this was just too rich and I have barely even scratched the surface, right?
Let me come back.
Why don't you just tell us what you're doing today? Because that's one of the questions that people are asking. People want to know what you're doing today and whether you're okay, whether you are able to still maintain sobriety.
Hmm,
And you had also mentioned something to me called SIBA. So why don't we spend the last few minutes talking about those things?
sure. So I do want to point out that it's very the feeling that I got when you asked if if people are curious, is he still sober and stuff. I feel the caring in that question, and I appreciate the sentiment behind it.
Well, I
Um,
have to tell you one thing. We
mhm,
have a very dedicated group of listeners here, some of whom have sent messages, and I really appreciate those messages. Very, a lot of very highly educated people listening to this,
mhm.
and it's going to go out to podcasts, and I hope that everybody gets to listen to this because this is just one of those really profound conversations. I'm just so grateful that you joined us today, Cody. So thank you. And yeah, I think you're probably perceiving it correctly. It's quite a well-educated, but also really well-meaning um, group of people who listen regularly. And man, the questions they ask are always really compelling for me
Mhm.
as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I do love the questions. I'm a little disappointed I rambled so long.
No, you
Um,
didn't ramble. It was so, like I
yeah.
said, I was so interested in the storytelling of it because reading the book is one thing, but hearing all your passion in it and just all those linkages to all these people whose names that many people know.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, it's really interesting that AA has this really kind of mystical, magical history that most people aren't aware of. They all think of it like, oh yeah, that's that thing that people go to, when they can't handle their drink or their drug, and then, it's all this religious stuff, but it's really not at all.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very mystical. And I feel so honored that I got to kind of add to that mysticality of the whole thing, and to show that like at the root of like the foundation was this guy who belonged in AA, his named Jaime de Angelo. So a guy that makes people in AA blush, from some of the stories we've heard. Yeah, so I mean, what am I doing now? So I am sober. I do want to say, I'm continuing my sobriety. I'm happy to say I've started attending another 12-step fellowship that I really appreciate, and I'll put a plug out for it because I think that this group, it's and the meetings are it's called ACA, Adult Children of Alcoholics and Dysfunctional Families, and I'm most impressed with ACA because what I don't see in ACA that perhaps has a tendency to emerge in the other 12-step fellowships is there's not a huge tendency to try to bypass or to try to have a spiritual bypass. The famous John Wellwood term, spiritual bypass. So in ACA, we talk a lot about our feelings. We talk a lot about the difficult nature of the relationships that we have and have had since childhood, and how alcoholism is in a large measure a response to childhood trauma. And I just think it's a beautiful message. I love it because every time I go, I have to I have to stop and pause and be with my own feeling and my own emotion, which is not easy for me. The way I grew up, and just, I mean, we could have great podcast episodes just about that. It's really my favorite topic these days. Um, the other thing that I'm doing, and I thank you so much for allowing me to talk about it. I launched a website literally last week, almost on accident. It's called Seba.health, SEBA.health. And what it is, it's actually it's an artificial intelligence. Okay, I know that's a bad word. But so it's an AI that I've trained on 2,500 years of literature uh, around depth psychology. So we have depth psychology, philosophy, philology, which is a huge thing of what I'm interested in and what I'm studying. Um, a lot of neuroscience, a lot of different psychological perspectives. Of course, Carl Jung is in there, James Hillman, Gabor Mate, Donald Kalshed. There's a lot of stuff about it's got a good smattering of all kinds of different kind of the foundation of what this little AI is trained on. I named it Sebastian, and the word comes it comes from Homer, from the Iliad, uh, where a goddess tells Achilles, "Let Sebas enter your Thumas." So that's kind of the foundation of this of Sebastian, and it's a great experience. So I've ran a few of my dreams through it. It does dream interpretation from a very interesting Jungian perspective. Yesterday, I talked to it a little bit about some of the stuff that's happening with me, with my relationship with my mother, the mother complex, this stuff, and its response was surprising.
Hmm.
Um, and not that I would ever encourage anybody to use an AI instead of see a therapist. In fact, there's something on Saber.health is an A the AI will actually help people find a therapist. So there's a directory. We've got 1,500 therapists listed right now. These are all kind of hand vetted, just people that are really kind of in a depth tradition. There's a lot of EMDR therapists, IFS, and if you do it, you could do a short interview with Sebastian, and it'll recommend 3 or 4 therapists for you, and hopefully walk you through the process of finding a therapist. So it's a really really exciting little thing that I'm doing, and yeah, so I invite everyone. It's free to use, so, and it's very interesting. A
So
great
that's
research tool.
Seba.health, and we are going to put it on our links as well so people can have it. We're going to have to close our conversation within nothing short of a minute because I know that it's going to go into an outtake shortly. I want to thank you so much, Cody, for joining us today. We'll have all those links. The podcast will be up for people to watch after. I want to invite everybody who's listening to have a very gentle day. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your words and your wisdom with us, Cody. And hopefully we'll have another conversation in the future. Wishing all of you a gentle day, and thank you so much, Cody, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with your host, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.